everyone. We're going to continue in this video with our look at the fourth chapter of the Stanley Baronet book on the topic informal fallacies. So last time we sort of walked through the basics of fallacious reasoning and dealt with some very common varieties of informal fallacy, the most common of which really turned out to be the ad hominem fallacy. If you recall, the ad hominem really is a kind of emotional appeal or a psychological appeal in which, rather than invalidating an argument or showing why a conclusion can't possibly be true, you simply try to discredit or insult the speaker of the argument. And we sort of walked through different versions in which the ad hominem can occur. So we're going to move along here with some other ways in which arguments can fail, other ways in which arguments can break down in everyday life. In section C, it's important to realize that we're dealing with inductive arguments, right, not deductive arguments. So with inductive arguments, the idea is, if you recall, conclusions are not said to follow with necessity from premises, but rather with a high degree of probability or with a high degree of certainty, right? So induction is a somewhat lower standard of guarantee, I guess, or supplies us with a less kind of definite guarantee of the truth of a conclusion. But still, there are all kinds of ways in which you can build really a bad inductive argument, one that doesn't provide any reason for believing the conclusion, even though it might sound as if it does. Okay, so the most common way in which induction can be fallacious is with what is called a generalization. All right, so we've probably all heard of generalizations in everyday life. So we're going to try to get a little bit technical with it. A generalization fallacy happens when an argument relies on a mistaken use of the principles behind making a generalization. Okay, this is kind of abstract language here in our textbook definition, so we're going to have to get a little more specific. Generalizations are pretty closely related to stereotyping or illogical usage of samples for evidence, right? As we explore further in logic, we're going to come to learn what is a valid inference from very general claims to particular claims, and how, in fact, it is not always reversible. We can't always go from a very specific or particular claim to a general or universal claim. The human mind is such that unfortunately, we are very inclined to making generalizations in a way that are not logically valid. We might, for example, have a few bad experiences with a certain type of person from a certain kind of background, and we might then infer that all people who belong to that group have those traits, right? This is known as stereotypy or prejudice, right? And so critical reasoning, if we study the laws of inference and what makes for a strong inductive argument, will help kind of immunize ourselves from that kind of fallacious generalization. So one variety of the generalization fallacy is what is called a rigid application of a generalization. What is a rigid application? The rigid application of generalization happens when a general rule is applied to a specific case to which it was not meant to be applied. This is very easily done in ordinary life, where we might not quite understand the rule that we are drawing on in order to make some kind of claim about a specific or particular instance. The fallacy results from the unwarranted assumption that a generalization is a universal rule. Okay, so we're going to have to explore in a little bit more closer detail what a general rule might look like and what a general claim or a universal claim really is and sounds like at the categorical level. But we make all kinds of general claims in ordinary life all the time, in terms of which we try to in a way, make very quick judgments about people and events and circumstances that we might encounter. Okay, so why does the reasoning fail? A generalization tends to have exceptions, right? And when we ignore those exceptions, we are committing a fallacy, right? So a generalization is not actually a universal claim. It is saying that um, X perhaps happens a lot of the time, or many people who belong to a certain group have certain traits, but not all, right? And so when we ignore the viability or the possibility of an exception to a general rule, we are committing a rigid application or a hasty generalization. So the hasty generalization occurs when a general claim, such as all, every, or whenever, these are kind of key indicator words that you might be making. A hasty generalization is inferred, right, is sort of said to follow from an inadequate sample size. So just to re-language this, a hasty generalization takes a very small amount of evidence and makes a very large generalization from it in a way that isn't actually authorized by the sample size. This happens in statistics a lot. It happens in the media a lot. A journalist might discover a few instances where, for example, receiving a certain medication might lead to a certain set of symptoms, but really the sample size investigated is not at all large enough to say that this will happen to everyone in the way that the journalist seems to be provoking, right? Um, we could have an example like this. I saw a student athlete behaving rudely. Perhaps all student athletes are rude and arrogant, right? There's a kind of natural tendency of the mind in terms of psychology to make that inference, right? But it's not actually a logical inference, right? There are going to be exceptions, right? Even if evidence has supplied me with some reason for believing that athletes are rude and arrogant, right? But there are going to be exceptions unless I can really determinately prove that every single athlete in the universe is rude and arrogant, right? But chances are that is not the case, and so therefore I'm making a hasty generalization. Why does the reasoning fail? The sample size is far too small. That should say too small for the inference, right? I can't move from that small amount of evidence to such a big kind of judgment about the group, student athletes, right? And so that's a hasty generalization. The inferential leap I want you to start to see here is not authorized, right? It is not a rational leap to move from that sample set to such a large claim. The fallacy of composition refers to transferring an attribute of individuals to the parts of the from individual parts of an object to the object as a whole. So the fallacy of composition is a movement of small parts to wholes. I know that's very abstract, but we do it all the time. The mistaken transfer of an attribute to the individual members of a class to the class unto itself. This is sort of another way of thinking about stereotyping, right? If we just think of one person who belongs to a certain ethnicity or a certain religion, maybe has the trait is deceitful, right? And then we say, well, all members of that religion or that ethnic group are deceitful, right? This would be a mistake of composition, right? So to look at an example here, I understand every word of the poem, therefore I understand the meaning of the poem. Okay, this is a fallacy of composition because the meaning of the poem, the larger whole, is not just a matter of the meaning of the individual words in the poem. You probably can understand this from your English class, right, or any class where you have to interpret and read a difficult book. It is not simply a matter of, right, cracking out a dictionary and writing down the definitions of the meanings of the individual words, because the meaning of the whole is different than the meaning of the parts, right? So this would be a fallacy of composition. And some have argued that artificial intelligence or AI often will make this fallacy of composition, of moving from discrete units of meaning to larger wholes that really elude the machinery of the chat of the language learning model, as it were. Okay, so that might be a possible limit of artificial intelligence, is not recognizing composition. Division is kind of the reverse here. Uh, Division is the mistaken transfer of an attribute of an object as a whole to the individual parts of the object. So if composition is moving from parts to whole in a fallacious way, division is moving from whole to parts in a fallacious way. Okay, so the mistaken transfer of an attribute of a class to the individual members of the class. So to make this more concrete, if we have a sentence like this, a couple of sentences, the United States is the richest country in the world. Therefore, all the citizens must be rich. Okay, so the fallacy is that we are taking a whole, the United States, and we are pointing to some attribute of the whole is rich. And then we're kind of inferring that every member that sort of constitutes that whole, all the people, the citizens of the whole, everyone in the United States are rich, right? And so we know pretty easily from experience, of course, that this isn't true. There are rich people, there are middle class people, and there are very, very poor people, right? So this would be a pretty cut and dry case of a fallacy of division bias sample. This happens a lot in the use of statistics. A bias sample, as used in support of statistical claims about an entire population, is really drawing on a set of stats that is misleading. Okay, how does it work? A sample is biased if it leaves out members of a subset of the population that will not be mentioned in the conclusion. In other words, this is usually used to kind of mislead someone with statistical evidence by only drawing on evidence that is tilting in favor of one conclusion rather than another. All right. So the reasoning breaks down because the premises, the biased sample, right, the information supplied by the statistics are faulty, and so the inference is not properly supported. This can be a very easy way to deceive readers of journals, of newspapers, or on TV, because statistics often have a very authoritative and objective sound to them, but if the evidence actually drawn upon is biased or slanted, the conclusion is not in any way following with much rational inferential support. Here's an example to make this concrete. Recently, a sample of 1,000 Catholics in the US revealed that 85% believe that abortion is morally wrong. Therefore, evidence shows that approximately 85% of all Americans believe that abortion is morally wrong. Okay, so this argument is marshaling some numbers here. We have 1,000 Catholics, we have 85% on the much divisive abortion debate. The fallacy here is that the sample that is being looked at are Catholics, and Catholics may not be representative of the United States in general. They might be more strongly opposed to abortion than the average American. And so the conclusion, evidence shows that 85% of all Americans believe abortion is morally wrong, is fallacious, right? The evidence does not actually show what the conclusion has inferred. Okay. Now, if it were to make some more narrow claim about Catholic beliefs, perhaps the argument could succeed. But this is moving from a subset of a population, Catholics, to the population in general in a way that kind of works with the sleight of hand here, trying to get you to ignore the slippage of the biased sample that is fallacious. False cause. This can be harder to pick up. False cause happens when there is a causal relationship between two events in time that is said to occur one after the other. What's wrong with that? Aren't we supposed to be looking at causality and like in the sciences or in politics? Aren't we supposed to be looking at underlying causes? Well, yes, we are, but proving causality is very, very hard. You need a lot of evidence in support of a causal, certainly temporal claim. So because causal claims require a lot of evidence, cause and effect claims that rely on insufficient evidence are fallacies of the false cause. In other words, The fallacy occurs where you're making a claim about something causing another event that really doesn't have enough evidence to back it up. Okay, and this happens a lot in politics and history, where large scale events in the world are said to issue from other events before them, but perhaps they haven't really been shown or demonstrated to follow causally in the way that has been portrayed. Okay, so be on the lookout for the false cause fallacy. Post hoc, this is kind of related. The fallacy occurs from the mistaken assumption that just because one event occurred before another, the first event must have caused the second event, right? So the post hoc fallacy is kind of reverse engineering causality when there may not be causality, all right? So the post hoc fallacy occurs from the mistaken assumption that one event occurred after another in a manner that necessitates the causal sequence of the prior event to the second event. Okay, so um, this is getting a little abstract, I realize, but be on the lookout for kind of efforts to sort of say that events that happen in the world that are usually negative media portrayals of, let's say, um, you know, bad health consequences stemming from certain kinds of behavior are happening with necessity when they're not really happening with necessity. There might be some other variable bringing about the negative health outcome, right? So here's an example to hopefully clarify this a little bit. Last week I bought a new car, and today I found uh, uh, and today I found I am being fired. Okay, sorry, with a little bit of typo here. I shouldn't have bought the car. It brought me bad luck. So superstitious thinking often deals in the post hoc fallacy. In other words, the person here is sort of stringing together events as though they were causally related to one another when they really aren't causally related to one another. The fact that I bought the car has nothing to do probably with being fired, right? But I have sort of, in a reverse engineering kind of way, post hoc brought them together in a way that leads me to believe that they are causally implicated. Okay, so the post hoc fallacy is often related to superstitious or kind of irrational beliefs about events in the world. Slippery slope. You've probably heard of the slippery slope. I just want to talk about this a little bit in detail because it's important. And it's often misused, or it's often treated, miscategorized. The slippery slope is a fallacy. Okay, so it's interesting that people will often refer to a slippery slope as though it were a reason to believe in a certain argument. All right, so politicians will often refer to the slippery slope of a certain law or a certain policy leading to all kinds of negative things. Right? If we introduce if we introduce gay marriage, this will lead to a slippery slope in which all kinds of terrible things will happen, right? Something like this is often said in politics. The slippery slope is actually a fallacy of reasoning, so it should never be something you're drawing on as support for a belief. It's actually fallacious, right? An argument is a slippery slope in that it attempts to connect a series of occurrences in a link in a chain directly, right, in a manner that appears to be very causally linked. But really, the final kind of outcome of this causal link is not actually inevitably stemming from the events that have been listed. Okay, so to put this another way, slippery slopes are kind of false causal chains, right? The slippery slope misleads by introducing a series of consequences that establish an alleged causal network between events when that causal network is not actually there. Okay, so the slippery slope is a kind of rhetorical device. It's a kind of trick of cognition or psychology that enables us to believe that all kinds of things in the world might be connected when they really are not connected. Why does it fail? Well, the links in the causal chain are usually very weak, perhaps circumstantial, or completely unsupported. And so you have strung together things that may not belong to one another in the effort to get someone to believe in the inevitability of a certain outcome when really that outcome hasn't been proven. Okay. Um, so let's try to get a little concrete here about what this would look like, since that was pretty abstract stuff. If we say something like this, if you start smoking marijuana for pleasure, then you will need more and more to achieve the expected high. You will begin to rely on it whenever you feel depressed. Eventually, you will experiment with more powerful drugs that act faster and last longer. Of course, the amount of drug intake will have to increase to achieve the desired results. The addiction will take hold and will lead to a loss of ambition, a loss of self esteem, the destruction of your health, and the dissolution of all social ties. Therefore, you should not start smoking marijuana. Okay, this is from page 144 of our textbook, lest you think I'm advocating drug use. But still, this is an example of a slippery slope because whoever's making this argument is stringing together all kinds of events, beginning marijuana with pleasure, needing more and more, leading to more powerful drugs, and an addiction taking hold in this kind of inevitable, fated, preordained manner, right? Really, this argument sounds as though these things are causally linked up with necessity, but really it hasn't proven the necessity of each event leading to every other. You would need way more evidence, both statistical and scientific or empirical, to really show that these events do lead with necessity from one to another. All right, so this might sound like a persuasive argument, right, to us, but we do have to kind of get skeptical and pick apart the ways in which each of these events is not necessarily tied to each other. Okay. Moving along here, fallacies of unwarranted assumption or diversion in section D. We have the example of begging the question. This is another fallacy that is really misused, or really even the language is completely misused now. I notice people will often say this begs the question when really they mean this raises the question, or this kind of demands a question. But that's not what begging the question means at all. Begging the question is really a fallacy of circular reasoning. All right, and by circular reasoning, we mean a fallacy where the premise of an argument is tacitly built into the conclusion of the argument. In other words, the argument is not really taking us anywhere because the definition of the conclusion is built in to the premises. So rather than proving that the conclusion is true, it assumes it is true from the structure of the premises. We're going to explore this in more detail as we look at formal logic, and we get into the logic of what is called a tautology, or an argument that is true by definition. But begging the question really is an instance where, in a kind of circular reasoning, we presuppose the conclusion in the premises. So when the relationship between premises and conclusions seems to rely on an unstated premise or a hidden or implicit assumption, the argument may be fallacious. So be on the lookout for begging the question, or circular reasoning, as it were. Here's an example of question begging. Government ownership of public utilities is a dangerous idea because it is socialism. So if we kind of break apart the argument here, we have kind of a claim like this: government ownership of public utilities is socialism. And the unproven assumption of this argument is that socialism is dangerous, right? This might be true, but the argument hasn't shown it. The argument would have to go about the work of providing evidence and providing reasons for believing that socialism is dangerous for this argument to actually be saying something. Otherwise, it's just spinning its wheels. It is taking for granted the truth that socialism is dangerous, when precisely that is the thing that should be demonstrated. Here's another example. The murder of a human being is always wrong. Therefore, capital punishment is always wrong. Okay, so The unproven assumption of such an argument would be that all killing is murder. Um, Not taking sides here, but advocates of capital punishment would argue precisely that capital punishment or execution by the state is not murder. It's a different type of act because the person in question is not an innocent human anymore, is a guilty convict, right? Now, maybe that's true, maybe that's false, but this argument is taking for granted that all killing is murder, when really it should be demonstrating that all killing is murder in order for this argument to work. So this would be an example of a hidden or implicit or unexplained premise. Okay, loaded questions or complex questions is another fallacy. A single grammatical question is asked, but a hidden within that question is another question to which the answer is assumed. So this is kind of similar to question begging. How does it work? The question is used to establish the truth of a hidden assumption, right? So the loaded question usually, you'll find examples of it in politics, and it's a way of kind of discrediting a political speaker or a political opponent, right? You might have a sentence like this: "Do you still cheat on your taxes?" Right? And the fallacy here is that it is taken for granted that the person in question, the person being addressed, really did at some point in the past cheat on their taxes, right? So even by answering this question, such a person would be sort of conceding the point when perhaps he never did cheat on his taxes, right? So there's a kind of truth hidden in or an assumption of cheating in the past that actually hasn't been demonstrated. It's just been taken for granted, right? So that's kind of can feed pretty easily into the ad hominem. It can become a variety of the ad hominem. Now I want to talk about some inferences that are fallacious, and that probably all of us are guilty of. It's myself included at some point in the past. It's just a very easy mistake of reasoning to make. The inference from ignorance, or the argumentum ad ignorantiam. What this is a fallacy that asserts that a claim is true or false simply because no one has proven it is true or false. In other words, we're starting from the admission of ignorance about something, and we are inferring knowledge from it, either with a value of true or with a value of false. So, how does the fallacy work? Well, typically we'll be dealing with an unknown, a kind of a question mark. X has or has not been proven true. Therefore, we infer, right, it is or is not false, right? So the movement from a state of ignorance to a state of truth or falsity about that condition is an inference from ignorance. We should be stopping with our ignorance, right? We should kind of say the next sentence from any claim about our ignorance should be, well, we don't know. We can't infer whether or not such and such is true or false, right? But we very often want to sort of fill in the gaps in our knowledge and just kind of infer anyway in the face of our ignorance. Why is this fallacious? Rather than suspending judgment, the person draws a conclusion that cannot be supported by absence of evidence, right? So we should suspend our judgment when we're ignorant of the truth or falsity of a given claim. But instead of doing that, we fallaciously kind of try to fill in the holes in our knowledge by inferring truth or falsity with no evidence, or very perhaps inadequate evidence. Okay, that's kind of abstract. So here's an example. This is a famous example of an inference from ignorance. If you remember Donald Rumsfeld, probably you don't, Secretary of Defense for the Bush second administration. This was in the build-up to the war in Iraq. Donald Rumsfeld was asked to kind of speak about the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in the build-up to war, and there was no evidence really in any clear sense that there were weapons. And Rumsfeld says, simply because you do not have evidence that something exists does not mean that you have evidence that it doesn't exist. Okay, as if to say, well, you can't prove that they don't have weapons, right? Just because we don't have evidence in positive support that they do doesn't mean that they don't have the weapons. All right. This is a classic inference from ignorance. He is starting with ignorance. We don't know if they have weapons or not. And instead of suspending judgment, he infers in a kind of provocative way that we should probably err on the side of inferring some positive state of affairs, i.e., they do have weapons, right? Because he can't prove otherwise. Uh, really, it would have been rational just to suspend judgment, just to say, well, we don't know. It's a question mark, right? But rather than stopping there, he moves to the inference that maybe they really do have weapons. Okay, so this is a classic inference from ignorance. Um, Strong reasoning that looks like an inference from ignorance. There are instances where concluding some state of affairs is or is not the case based on lack of proof, right? So the idea here would be in a trial, a criminal trial, the context of a criminal trial. Um, it's important to bear in mind, I think I mentioned last time, that the prosecutor really does not have to prove that the party in question is guilty. The prosecutor just has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person is guilty. So you can kind of refuse to agree that they have proven beyond reasonable doubt without positive proof of innocence, right? Those are different things. Okay, so failing to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt is not the same thing as really proving that the person is innocent, because it's much harder to prove that someone is truly innocent, right? So in the courtroom, we have a lot of confusion and fallacious reasoning regarding the inference from ignorance. Okay, another kind of form of informal fallacy is the appeal to unqualified authority. This is all too common now in everyday life and in the media. This is a fallacy of appealing to authority in a fallacious way. And what it means to appeal to an authority is to kind of provide support for an argument based on the credentials or the expertise of a belief of someone relevant to that claim, right? So opinions based on those who have no credentials, expertise, or authority are not sufficient proof of a particular conclusion, right? Why does the reasoning fail? Well, appealing to someone's sense of deference to expertise when that expertise is irrelevant or misapplied is fallacious, right? It is not rational. This might happen when, let's say, you are trying to prove something about, the health-giving properties of a certain food, and you appeal to the authority of, let's say, an Instagram influencer, right? Someone who has no credentials about health and diet, and perhaps your argument is drawing on a lot of numbers and facts, but really the authority that you are relying on is no authority at all. And so this would be a fallacious appeal to unqualified authority. Okay. False dichotomy is a very common fallacy. This is where you're kind of drawing a comparison between two opposing claims that really are not so opposed. The false dichotomy happens when two options are presented as being exclusive of one another when they're not. In fact, there might be more than two options on the table. Why is this fallacious? The erroneous assumption at work is that these are the only options when really there might very well be many more, right? And usually this is kind of a rhetorical trick that politicians will use to get you to believe in the simplicity of a policy when really it's much more complex. Okay, so we'll talk more about false dichotomy as we get into different truth values. But I also want you to be on the lookout for the straw man fallacy. This is often used in politics, in journalism, and it's a fallacy of misrepresentation. It's a fallacy of kind of presenting a weak version of a position that you want to oppose or contradict, right? So the straw man happens when someone's position is distorted to such a point that it really isn't actually bearing any resemblance to the person's actual position, right? So politicians do this a lot. They will distort and so twist out of shape their opponent's policies that it then becomes very easy for them to sort of hack away at the straw man, right? And it becomes very easy for them to contradict the values, the validity of the claim. Why the reasoning fails? Well, if the original position is not accurately represented, then its refutation is not so important, right? The refutation of the straw man doesn't actually refute the original position. It's only refuting this sort of distorted caricature of the original. Okay, so try to get good at straw manning one's opponent. When is a politician or someone in the media so completely misrepresenting another's position that their critique doesn't actually bear very much weight on the original? Okay, red herring. We'll talk about this and then we will call it a day here. A red herring is kind of a tactic of distraction. It's really an attempt to draw attention away from the real issue at hand, right? So the red herring is a fallacy that diverts attention away from the real issue of the argument and then asserts a conclusion has been drawn, right, from its premises. So it's kind of a deflection of the issue in favor of some other position that really isn't all that relevant, right? So the conclusion has in fact been drawn from diversion premises, from premises that are not particularly pertinent to the actual issue, right? So the red herring is a fallacy because rather than contradicting the premises of an opposing argument, the red herring diverts attention to similar and perhaps maybe related, but ultimately irrelevant premises. And so rather than contradicting the actual argument, the red herring simply kind of deflects the issue onto some other issue. All right, and the red herring might appear to be very persuasive because taken independently, it might be a very good, valid argument, but it's still has entailed a kind of shifting of attention away from the original argument. Okay, that's all for now. Those are our fallacies. As I say before, there are really many more fallacies in chapter 4, so I kind of encourage you to have a look at some of those. But these are the ones that I'm going to kind of hold you responsible for. And we're going to move on in chapter 5 from informal logic to formal logic and have a look at categorical syllogisms. So until next time, everyone.